Hello everybody, I'm Philip J. Watt. This is Dissect Media, a Revive Australia production, and today's interview is with Jeremy Beck from the Citizen Electoral Council. A very important interview on many different levels, especially because Australia is faced with significant concerns economically, not just within the housing market, but regarding the banks and their interdependence and interconnection on the global stage with the global derivatives market, which I think is over $1 quadrillion at the moment. One big scamming of the system, a very disgraceful circumstance, and we are at significant risk with us, the people on the ground, once the next hiccup or crash or whatever happens on the global stage, because we are very vulnerable in terms of our interconnection on those levels, as just mentioned, plus with our private debt bubble, there's a whole host of issues. So I needed to have this interview and share this information with our audience. Very important stuff. So very important that you share this interview and help others in more of the mainstream echo chambers to understand there is a response to what's going on in the banking and housing markets. And it's a very solid one, and we can do it anytime soon. So welcome, Jeremy. I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Thanks, Philip. Good to talk.
Now, you guys released a media release on the 8th of May, basically outlining what this unmitigated disaster in the housing market and consequently the banks is, and what you're going to do about it. And as soon as I read it, I saw the logic and sensibility in it, and really appreciate the work that you guys are doing over at the CEC because of that. So why don't you just start off with providing a summary of that article? What is the housing market situation we're in? What's the banking situation in? And how do you think we should respond to it?
Sure. Well, the headline of the media release, Disaster Looming in Housing and Banks, What's Canberra Going to Do About It? We're warning about a depression. We're warning about a housing collapse not seen in our lifetimes. We're going back to the 1890s when we did face such a crisis with a housing crash and a banking crash. I might add that in the 1890s, most of Australia's banks failed. Now, that would seem foreign to us that one of the big four banks would fail, but that's what we're facing because most of the mortgage and most of the lending in the banking business has been in real estate. And because it's so exposed to the real estate and we've had an unprecedented housing boom, that means that the banks are also in trouble. Not to mention the people who are in negative equity. And negative equity means when people buy a house and they have a mortgage and the house price collapses, so they end up having a mortgage that's more than what the house is worth. And that's already happening now. People are facing that in Melbourne and Sydney. In Sydney, housing prices have collapsed around about 15%, Melbourne about 10 or 11%. It's going down faster in Melbourne. Sydney started first, but Melbourne's prices are collapsing faster than Sydney. They're the two biggest markets in Australia. But because of this, when people face the situation when they can't afford to pay that mortgage, the mortgage stress levels are unprecedented. When they can't afford to pay that mortgage, that means that the banks are in trouble. Now, a lot of people think that, how could that happen? The banks have made these record profits. But a lot of those profits are made from this fraud of this bubble and also the derivatives that you did mention before. The derivatives in Australia are around about $37, $38 trillion. It actually went up to $40 trillion at its peak, just for Australia alone and Australia's banks, which we've been monitoring very closely because if you have a look at the time of the global financial crisis, the derivatives levels in Australia's banks were around about $14 trillion. So in a space of 10 years, it's gone from 14 trillion to 40 trillion. Now it's dropped off a bit, and it did drop off a bit in the last global financial crisis. And now it's already started to drop off. There's a long way to fall though. And there's a long way to fall for the housing prices too, because if you have a look at the housing prices, we've seen a 10 or 15% in various areas, even greater falls, but that's nowhere near what we're about to see. We're about to see a much, much bigger crash than that, going by the bubble and going by the housing affordability. So,
and we sort of, just to interject just quickly, Jeremy, we need a bit of a housing correction anyway, don't we? Because the cost of living and the cost of renting and owning properties is just unsustainable. So it's important that we do go through a correction, but at the same time, there's a big sacrifice for banking and society in general.
Well, sure, housing is not affordable. Young people just simply can't afford to buy homes unless they've had some inheritance or got a dual income family. And even then, with two average incomes, you're struggling, you're just debt slaves. So sure, we do need a correction, but it has to be an orderly one. And that's why we're called for a moratorium. We've been calling this for many years. I know back a decade or so ago, we were calling for what's called the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act. And we saw this coming even back then, a decade ago, because the housing bubble is not some recent phenomenon. This has been an long-going policy. Now, Homeowners and Bank Protection Act would revalue the mortgages down to reflect the house price, because the house price has crashed. It's not fair that you pay back the bank $1 million if your house price is dropped, turned down to $500,000. You shouldn't owe the bank that much. The banks won't obviously do that, but the government has to step in and make that happen. But the number one policy we've been pushing is Glass-Steagall, because at the end of the day, the Royal Commission into the banks, it showed so much fraud in the banking system. It's unbelievable, that the conflicts of interest. What Glass-Steagall does is it separates out the essential everyday banking that we do need. We need banks. We can't go back to bartering. But we need to separate out the everyday banking that we all need, businesses need, homeowners need, and separate that from the investment banking side of the things, which if people want to take risks of their money, fine, they should take risks, but don't allow that to risk the entire global financial system, when in Australia's case, Australia's banks. So we're calling to separate out commercial banks from investment banking. Now, we call it Glass-Steagall because the original Glass-Steagall Act was implemented in 1933 in the Great Depression in the United States. It worked very, very well, because what we're seeing now with a bubble, bubbles aren't new. We've had bubbles for hundreds of years, but there was a particularly bad bubble in the 1920s. It was called the Roaring Twenties, and in Wall Street, the excesses of Wall Street that led to the Great Depression, it got so serious that there was actually action to deal with that. And the Roosevelt administration there in the United States, under two politicians, Glass and Steagall, that they named them after their politicians, the legislation over there, they formed this act in 1933 to separate out the essential banking that they all needed from the risky investment banking, so that the investment bankers wouldn't risk everyone's money. Now, it's particularly important for Australia with these bank derivatives that I mentioned that are close to $40 trillion. You only need just a few percentage fall in the Australian derivatives, and that could wipe out a lot of people's deposits. And having said that, this is not some academic idea. The government has already passed through crisis legislation to enable a bail-in. And that's where people will lose their deposits or their investments. So this is why we need the Glass-Steagall side of legislation to separate out that risky banking from the essential everyday banking. Now, the crisis legislation that was ran through actually on Valentine's Day last year, 2018, great day to put it through, that was snuck through. There was only a handful of senators in the parliament at the time and a handful in the House of Representatives. When they snuck that through, the crisis legislation says that any financial instrument could be bailed in. Now, bail-in is when the financial institutions had a recapitalisation through essentially stealing creditors' money. And if it's the case of a bank, that could include deposits. So what we've got is a situation where the government knows we've got a financial crisis. We have it. We've had sources which have confirmed to us that our government is actually dealing with other governments, private secret meetings with other governments, overseas governments who have gone through the financial crisis, such as Ireland and Italy and Spain. They're approaching those governments to find out what Australia should do come this crisis. Now, they won't tell Australians that at the moment they're saying, oh, the economy is good and sound and strong. They know it's not. And why would they pass that crisis legislation last February if they did think it was strong? They've been forced to, through the Financial Stability Board, and this is a foreign organisation set up by the Bank for International Settlements to dictate to nations around the world to go for bail-in. And people have lost their life savings. It's already happened in Italy, the notable case in Cyprus, where people have lost their life savings when the banks collapse. And that's now on the books in Australia. So we urgently need this Glass-Steagall to separate everyday banking accounts from this risky side of the investment banking, particularly derivatives, of course, that I mentioned.
I'll just jump in there because the BIS is the central bank of central banks, right? It's based in Switzerland. And then you've got central banking distributed networks right throughout the Western world. The Reserve Bank of Australia is very connected to the BIS, and it's actually an independent agency separate to the Treasury, unlike how it used to be when we had the CBA or the Commonwealth Bank of Australia early back in the 1900s. So essentially, the entire money supply or banking industry on the global scale, much of it is interconnected and run and privatized, essentially. So, ironically, they're talking about the Valentine's Day rushing in that bail-in legislation. What an absolute tragedy! It's an irony. It's a disgrace. It's a spit in Australians' face, straight up. This is what we think of our love for you, and that's just unbelievable. But let's move on to, because whilst it's super important to understand the need to break apart this commercial and investment banking, ultimately money is created out of nothing. These private organisations create money out of nothing. They earn interest of that, or the profits. When you get a mortgage or loan or credit card debt, that is all new money. It didn't come from a new account. All new money created out of nothing, and then they enrich themselves off that process. Now, we used to have something called public banking. When you talk about dropping, say, a $1 million loan to $500,000 to connect with what it's actually worth now, do you see that as new credit being issued by a people's bank? How do you see that happening? What do you feel about the response to making sure that we have public money or monetary sovereignty? Explain that a little bit more simply than what I just did for the audience.
Sure. Well, we used to have the old Commonwealth Bank, and originally when King O'Malley set up the Commonwealth Bank, he envisaged that to be a true public bank, government run for the good of the nation, for the good of the people. It wasn't there to make a profit, it was there to develop the nation. So we've had a long campaign to have a government bank similar to the old Commonwealth Bank. It was a tragedy that Paul Keating and Bob Hawke set the ball rolling when they privatised the Commonwealth Bank. John Howard finished it off. It was privatised in 3 tranches. So between Hawke, Keating and Howard, they privatised our public government bank. The Commonwealth Bank originally was designed to deliver credit into the physical economy to build grand infrastructure projects. And that's really, at the end of the day, money, it's not worth anything unless you direct it into something productive to create real wealth. So we've been calling to build major infrastructure projects. We did it once in the past. We built the Snowy Mountain Scheme. We did great things. We even built a railway line right across the Nullarbor Plain that links Perth and Melbourne. Amazing that we had just horses and camels to do that. And if we could do that back then, surely we could do much better now. We only need to have the financial institutions and the government bank to direct the credit in there, not to make long-term, short-term profit, but to have a long-term gain. Now, we've got a whole lot of major projects that we've been calling for. There's the Bradfield scheme, which has been on the books for many decades, since the 1930s. Our greatest engineer in Australia, John Bradfield, he was the one who built the Sydney Harbour Bridge. He built the whole underground tunnel system for the railways, the underground railway system in Sydney. He built the Story Bridge in Brisbane. He designed dams. It was Australia's greatest engineer. He designed the Bradfield scheme, which would divert the floodwaters from the Tully, the Herbert and the Burdekin rivers, which are in northern Queensland, over the Great Dividing Range, or through tunnels. You can do it two ways. You can pump it over the top, or you can have tunnels through the mountains and send it inland where it's needed. Now, if we had that scheme, it could have been built decades ago. If we had that scheme, we wouldn't have had all these fish dying and not just the Bradfield scheme, there's a Clarence River scheme, which is another one, similar idea, send the water over the Great Dividing Range, inland where it's needed. But we wouldn't have fish dying in the Darling River. We wouldn't have farmers suffering the droughts that they're suffering right now. We'd open up the country for enormous development, for the good of all Australians, and we wouldn't just be having population centres just in capital cities where we just crammed into Melbourne and Sydney and so forth, you're stuck in traffic jams. But, there's a whole big country. Let's develop it and build infrastructure. The infrastructure is going to uplift everyone's living condition, and it will give the youth, the young people, a vision and a future. At the moment, there are a lot of young people there, they just don't really have a mission in life, and it's not really their fault. It's because the government has created these conditions, because the government is controlled. The government is controlled by foreign forces, foreign banks, a financial oligarchy, and at the end of the day, this oligarchy's agenda is population control. They literally want to wipe us out or keep us in poverty. And we have to break away from that, or there's simply no future. And we can. We know that there's a growing awareness of this. More and more people are questioning the mainstream media. I'll get back to the point on Valentine's Day we're talking about, when they ran through this crisis law. The mainstream media didn't even say a thing about it. At the time, all they were talking about was Barnaby Joyce's sex life. That was what they were talking about at the time. But now, more and more people, they know that you can't trust the mainstream media. So, they're looking to alternative forums. And, we're part of the biggest grassroots movement in this country, the Citizens Electoral Council. We've got candidates, we've got Senate candidates. We've got the necessary policies to deal with this, and we're willing to work with all sorts of like-minded people to get these ideas out, because at the end of the day, it's not my ego or any of, it's all about the good of the nation. At the end of the day, that's the most important thing, because without these ideas, the next generation doesn't have a future.
Well said, and absolutely we need to organise the infrastructure for water capturing and redistributing throughout our nation. We've, as you mentioned, could have done that a long time ago, but we have a two-party system, as you mentioned, that is run by a corporate oligarchy. It is the reality. People need to understand this if they don't. The two-party system has sold out our freedoms and also our nation on many, many levels, and we need to make sure we take that back. So as I understand it, the basic process is install Glass-Steagall Act, which gets rid of these bail-in laws. That means if there is a global financial crisis, then the big four banks, which are mostly foreign owned anyway, most of the profits from this stuff goes overseas anyway, from creating money out of thin air, and that goes to the big, the central banking cartels. But then you've got also, if there is a hiccup in our financial or housing markets, the banks need to take the hit from that, because they are the ones that create all these derivatives, etc. So deal with it. We can create a People's National Bank and issue credit, meaning that is money, new money created out of nothing, just like Dennis and Miller did for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia back in 1912 to 1923, I think it was. An absolute unsung Australian hero. I love him. I can't wait for a proper documentary to come out on this fella. Somebody out in Australia make it, for Christ's sake, because he's a legend. What he done for this country, funded these massive infrastructure projects, as well as funded World War I as well, and turned around and said, I could have funded 10 World War Is, because he was literally just creating money out of nothing. So ultimately, the people's money supply needs to be reinstored through a proper national bank. I personally have a very deep fondness for a decentralised network of local public banks to deal with local community issues such as homelessness and poverty and addiction and you name it, whatever socioeconomic issues we have. It should be a decentralized network, in my view, so that the communities have control over that, instead of being done in a centralized fashion at the federal level. And then ultimately, we have a public banking network that competes with the private banking network to keep them honest, and to make sure that we're dealing with the infrastructure needs that we have. So is that the general gist of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Because the banks do create money out of thin air. That's true. And moreover, they're even considering going with quantitative easing, which is really the problem with that is they are creating money, but it's not being directed into useful things that we all need. It's
the Main Street economy, not Wall Street.
Yeah, it's propping up their failed system. A lot of this money will just go into propping up, toxic assets. Now, we need that money to be going into bridges and roads and railway lines and schools and hospitals and things that we all need, not to prop up toxic assets. And this quantitative easing is a problem. If you go back into history, it had Weimar Germany. They did print so much money that they're literally carrying around wheelbarrow loads of money, and it was as good as useless. Just to buy a loaf of bread, you'd need so much money. They ended up burning the notes because they were better off burning to keep warm in the winter than for what they were for anything else. Sure, banks create money. It can be a good thing if it's directed into the productive economy. But if it's just printed willy-nilly, it'll cause dangerous hyperinflation. Or if it's done through the financial oligarchy through quantitative easing, well, all it's doing is just propping up a failed system and buying toxic assets.
Now, in terms of this widespread nationwide infrastructure expansion, you talked about the water, you talked about, I think you mentioned rail. I'm not sure if that was prior to the interview or in the interview, but I also see hemp playing a massive role in this, because you can create all of your plastics, your fuels, your building materials, you can create whole houses, whole cars, you can pretty much create all of your furniture and clothing and basically everything, and not just that, medicine, food, a whole host of amazing toxin-free, environmentally friendly products that you can localize, because we can all create our hemp locally and then build an industry that revolves around hemp manufacturing and production. So do you see hemp playing a major role in this infrastructure expansion?
Well, you're talking about hemp without the THC in it, not the one with the drugs. Is that right?
That's right. It's all part of the cannabis plant. And we have an endocannabinoid system in our body that absorbs the cannabinoids from cannabis. So we are literally connected to it on a medicinal level. That's through CBD and also THC. THC has got high medicinal qualities as well, not for all ailments. But the science is really clear on that. But I'm not talking about using it as a medicine with THC. I'm talking about hemp itself is a strain of cannabis which can be, it grows 12, 15 foot tall. You've got no, very little THC. It's like 0.2%, very little. You couldn't smoke enough of it to get stoned or whatever. But you use the fibers, the stalk, and also the leaves. It's actually a superfood. It's 33% protein, the actual seed. And it's fantastically amazing. The best oils you can get, the right balance of 3, 6, and 9 omega. It's it's phenomenal. But you can create complete cars. The plastic you can make from hemp cannot just replace oil-based plastic bags and bottles and all that sort of stuff, but you can also create a hemp plastic that is 10 times stronger than steel. In fact, Henry Ford built a car completely made out of hemp in 1940s. And the other reason hemp was illegalized, not because it was a drug, because it competed with the cotton industry, because it competed with the pharmaceutical industry, of course, because you can grow your own cannabis and you got your own medicine then. But it also competed with the petrochemical industry, because hemp doesn't need toxic sprays and chemicals like cotton and like all these other agricultural systems. And so essentially it is great for the environment and great for local industry. So that might be something you weren't aware of until now, obviously, Jeremy.
I've heard those arguments before. We don't have a policy on that, other than that we are concerned about drug use. We're concerned about the oligarchy using drugs to keep a whole generation of people doped out and dumbed down. We're affiliated with the international organisation set up by Lyndon LaRouche, who just recently passed away earlier this year. He organised a book called Dope Inc., which drove Henry Kissinger crazy. And that was exposing the role of the oligarchy, financial oligarchy, pushing drugs on the population. So we do have concerns there. Now, you're talking about obviously different things because you're talking about it used for various different products, and that's a different story again. But as far as the drugs are concerned, we certainly have grave concerns. We know that the oligarchy does want to keep people dumbed down and drugged out and doped out. We've had a heroin epidemic. We've had an ice epidemic. A lot of these drugs are very dangerous. So we certainly, our policies historically have obviously been opposed to drug use. But in terms of what you're talking about there, that's a different story. We haven't covered that in our policies.
That's okay. That's okay. It's really only becoming part of the cutting edge discourse over the last, well, it's been around for the last several decades, but it's really starting to come out now that the versatility of hemp and how we can localize our industry and revitalize our economies. And essentially, we've got monopolization issues, right? So we need to localize in response to that. We've got centralization issues, so we need to decentralize in response to that. We don't need to ship all these oil-based products around the world. We don't need to go into oil wars over in the Middle East. We can create all of our fuels, our plastics, our everything I just mentioned before with hemp on the ground locally. So that is where we're going, that Australia will be the hemp country in the future. That's why I'm such a passionate advocate for it. And regarding all the drugs, of course, you know, the pharmaceutical industry is the biggest drug dealer in the world, and they are most certainly dumbing down people on many levels, including the fluoride in our water, and that is a very serious issue that we need to face. But that's okay. That's not necessarily your forte. Let's move on to you're really over the target about how to organise this money supply, how to uncouple ourselves from this global financial oligarchy that want to maintain power and control. Iceland did it back in 2010, I think. They started at least a good process with that to regain their sovereignty. And Australia can really do this. I really believe in Australia ensuring our sovereignty monetarily, but also from all of these monopolies, petrochemical, pharmaceutical, media, you name it, we've been monopolised. We need to take back our sovereignty through money first and foremost, which is why I'm a massive fan of what you talked about in your papers. Now, you've got Senate candidates. Do you have House representative candidates? Where are you guys representing in the 2019 election?
Sure, we've got Senate candidates in every single state across Australia. So look for Citizen's Electoral Council on the ballot. And also in the Northern Territory, the only area we don't have Senate candidates is in the ACT. But we're running a couple of House candidates in Victoria. We've got one in the Mallee and one here in Calwell. But unfortunately, we simply don't have the funds to run House candidates everywhere. The Australian Electoral Commission doubled the nomination fee from $1,000 to $2,000. I don't think inflation's gone up by that much, but it's a good way to try and squash out smaller political parties. But not to worry, that can change. And I'll tell you what, the revolution we're creating is much bigger than voting. The awareness is the most important thing, you know, regardless of whether or not we get anyone elected, even if we get no one elected, which is quite possible. You know, we have run candidates plenty of times in the past and haven't got anyone elected. That hasn't really got us depressed at all. In fact, we're quite thrilled that we're able to get our message out here more effectively and work with more people. In fact, we're having a lot of good relationships with a lot of people who are in the parliament. For example, Bob Katter put our bill to break up the banks in the House. Pauline Hanson put it in the Senate. Now, we don't agree with Bob Katter on everything. We don't agree with Pauline Hanson on everything. That's fine. We don't agree with the Greens on everything either, but the Greens also support the same principle. The Greens support breaking up the banks. So we're working with a lot of people from different sides of politics and uniting them around the most important issues. And the most important issue is that we are facing a global financial crisis. In fact, it's so bad here in Australia that Australia could trigger the global financial crisis. Now, that's a pretty big statement to make. We're a relatively minor economy on the world scene. We've got a relatively small GDP compared to the United States or any of the other big countries. But Australia's housing bubble is so bad, our derivatives in our banks are so bad that we could trigger the global financial crisis. So that's the most important thing, is to deal with that. Deal with the fallout. The social fallout could be horrendous if it's not dealt with properly. People being booted out of their homes through foreclosures. It doesn't bear thinking about how bad social unrest could get. So they're the most important things to look at now. And to deal with that, obviously taking on the banks and Glass-Steagall and the national banking is the core policy that we're running on, along with obviously building the infrastructure.
Yeah, look, I love how you said that you're happy to work with different groups, even though you might not necessarily agree with their entire policy platform or philosophical underpinnings. I completely agree. I think you are absolutely over the target when it comes to the banking and money issue. I would add to that that you need to incorporate the hemp over the target aspect as well, because that is definitely over the target, simply because it gives the power to the people. You can create all your food, all your resources on the ground with hemp. That's a very, very huge aspect of this regaining our sovereignty. So I'm happy to send you some information about that later. That's absolutely fine. But ultimately, none of us have got it all perfect. We're all working it out. We're unfolding. We're trying to figure out what Australia needs to do for how we move forward. We definitely need to localise. We definitely need to decentralise. We definitely need to get hold of our industry and our resources and our water and all these things that you've been talking about. We have a grand opportunity over the next decade to really come together as an Australian community and make sure that the people who work in our government, because after all, us the people, we are the government. We are choosing to elect these people at the moment, and that's unfortunate. It's been programmed, should I say, by the mainstream media, unfortunately. But we've got a huge opportunity coming up, not just in this election, but over the next 10 years to really bring sovereignty and prosperity back to our nation. So thank you for all the work that you guys do over in the CEC. And would you like to just have one more final pitch as to why Australians should vote for you?
Well, thanks, Philip, for inviting me on your show. I just say, look at all the candidates and study the policies carefully, because at the end of the day, the mainstream media, they want to dumb everyone down. They want to keep people misinformed of the issues. So, study our platform. It's on our website, www.cecaust.com.au. And there's plenty of policy detail on our website for you to make up your mind. At the end of the day, if you want to make your vote valid, of course, 1 to 6 above the line or 1 to 12 below the line, they've changed that system, which I think is one of the better things they've changed, because at least you're in control of your vote rather than automatically going to party preferences. And we recommend people preference 1 CEC and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other parties which support similar policies, and particularly on the Glass-Steagall issue, to break up the banks. Because if those banks aren't broken up, if we don't separate out this conflict of interest they have, the looting will keep going, and it's going to get a lot worse unless we make some big changes very soon.
Well, we had a Prime Minister called Malcolm Turnbull at one stage, who was an ex-managing director of Goldman Sachs and highly linked to the pharmaceutical monopolies. What a massive conflict of interest for our country, an absolute disgrace. That will be dealt with as time goes on. We will not allow this two-party system to continue selling out our country. It's an absolute travesty. People need to be very clear about what you've just said. We can only prioritise or preference minor parties and independents in the Senate. That was one good policy or action that the Greens did take. I'm pretty sure that was linked to some of the Greens' work. And we'll need to do that with ending the forced preferential voting in the House of Reps soon too. So that'll be over the next few years. We'll get rid of that. We need a campaign, get the people together to make sure we end forced preferential voting in the lower house. Just a quick comment on the mainstream media. Most of the journalists are just indoctrinated into their echo chambers. Most of them don't understand. They're just brainwashed like the rest of society about these issues, unfortunately. And it's up to us to emancipate ourselves, and it's up to the journalists to emancipate themselves. But ultimately, the multi-billionaires who run these media monopolies, they have agendas. Of course they do. And it's not necessarily how they lie. It's more the truth that they emit, the meta-narratives that they don't talk about. That is the biggest problem, because most people aren't aware of this conversation that we're having today. Thanks again, Jeremy. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Philip.